Hello. This is a sermon for the 21st of August 2022. That's the 21st in Ordinary Time, Year C. The readings are Jeremiah chapter 1, 4 to 10, Hebrews chapter 12, 18 to 29, and Luke chapter 13, 10 to 17. "Take me to the Pope," he said. "I must see him straight away." The request came from a young giant of a man from Florida who turned up at my door in Rome one day under the misapprehension that because I was the Methodist representative to the Holy See, that would give me immediate access to the papal apartments. After explaining I was rather lower in the pecking order than he had assumed, he told me why he had such an urgent need of a meeting. "I'm a born saint," he said. "God has declared me a saint, and I want to see the Pope to tell him." After trying a few of my colleagues around the city who also didn't have immediate access to the papal apartments, I think he reluctantly went home, possibly with the help of the American embassy, I believe. That guy intimidated some women in our congregation for a few weeks simply by his domineering physical presence. But in fact, he was a gentle giant. The only guy who ever frightened me was one who came by one week aggressively telling everyone how sinful we were and how righteous he was. But there was a menacing edge to his ranting. "I've never even read about anyone as holy as me," he said to the Australian Archbishop who was hosting us all for lunch. It makes me think that some of the Old Testament prophets might not have been easy to live with, but they don't betray that deluded self-righteousness of the true fanatic. Jeremiah, for instance, tries to offload his divine call by telling God he is too young. Isaiah said he was unworthy because he was a man of unclean lips. Both Moses and St. Paul claim to be poor speakers. Diffidence, incredulity, fear, a sense of unworthiness. These are the signs of an authentic call. We need to be very cautious about encouraging those who are absolutely certain of their unique ability to speak on God's behalf. Yet our excuses and fears are not sufficient to resist God's call when it comes. As we see, God promises to strengthen Jeremiah by being constantly at his side and by putting the words into his mouth. The call to speak on behalf of God is a fearful responsibility that only a fool would rush into. Jeremiah is told that it will be difficult, that it will include times for pulling down, uprooting, overthrowing and destroying before any planting and building. Religious fanatics like the destroying and the uprooting part of the assignment, but a sane person fears that the most. We all wish to be popular, and it is with great trepidation any preacher starts making enemies. Who wants to be thought of as a fanatic or a fool? But following God's call means it is not always possible to remain friends with everyone. It is a cost that weighs very heavy on the heart of every sane individual. Jesus also knew the cost of speaking out. He is moved by compassion when he sees the woman bent double, unable to stand erect. Despite it being the Sabbath, Jesus restores her, not just physically, but also to her rightful place in the community, as she too is a daughter of Abraham. We cannot be sure, but in a society that regarded physical illness and misfortune as a sign of one's inner spiritual health and relationship with God, it could be that the community ostracized this woman on the assumption that she was crippled through some sin on her part. She may have had the right to be a daughter of Abraham, but it is possible the community did not treat her as such, and perhaps resented her presence in their synagogue, believing she was spiritually unsuitable to associate with them. By healing her, Jesus restores her physically, but in the eyes of the community, he restores her spiritually too, and thereby restores her socially also, to resume her rightful place within her family and district. Little later, Luke will tell us of Zacchaeus, the diminutive tax collector, who by different means is also restored to his rightful place as a son of Abraham. However, the synagogue leader takes offence against Jesus for this Sabbath day cure. He cares more about the outward conformity to the law than he does about this poor woman who has been restored. He's a prime example of how easily religious office holders can fail to see wood for trees and start sweating the small things and miss the big picture. The self-appointed gatekeeper into God's fold, the synagogue leader, is actually on the outside himself. He is condemned by Jesus as a hypocrite. The ordinary people were delighted. In their simplicity, they could see the obvious fact that what Jesus had done was a wonderful and beautiful act. The synagogue leader and those like him were blind to what Jesus was doing, and ironically, it was their use of the holy law of God that had blinded them. As I say, sometimes we can't see wood for trees. The opponents are said to have been humiliated, verse 17. This is not what Jesus would have wished, but it is the inevitable consequence of their disagreement. To speak the truth does call for the courage to stand one's ground and resist those that wish to impose an alternative version of the truth. Confrontation is unfortunately always part of religion, even that of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. How easy it would have been to say nothing and keep on the right side of everyone that day, at the cost of seeing the poor woman bent double go home in the same condition in which she arrived. Christ does not impose his version of the truth on others by force. The Christian way is to turn the other cheek and, if necessary, go to the cross. But to stand firm on what Christ has revealed as the truth remains our sacred duty, despite the cost. The letter to the Hebrews urges some Jewish Christians who are tempted to renounce their Christian faith in the face of hostility from their fellow Jews to stand firm. The letter does not urge them to use force against opponents. It does not call for a military crusade or jihad, but it does urge believers to witness even in a hostile situation. The writer compares the shocking power of earthly holiness as exercised under Moses to the joyful power of heavenly holiness under Christ. It was decreed that such even an animal innocently wander upon God's holy mountain whilst Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments, that animal should die. Hebrews 12:20 and Exodus 19:12 and 13. A person trespassing upon the mountain would also pay the ultimate price. The writer contrasts the fearful consequences of disobeying Moses at Sinai for the sake of a world that will ultimately be shaken and pass away, with the joyful promises of heaven which shall never pass away. The writer is encouraging his hearers to remain loyal to the unshakable holy mountain of heavenly Jerusalem, rather than be intimidated by the fearful threats from earthly Jerusalem. Christians should not be motivated by fear, because they know the ultimate victory has already been secured by the saving blood of Christ. And they are not alone in this hostile world, for they are cheered on their way by the saints above and the angelic host. This reminds me of a story about the Celtic holy man, the Venerable Bede in Northumberland. This great man is renowned as one of the church's great historians. He was a famous scholar and man of prayer during his own lifetime. But the younger generation were not so easily impressed. To the young monks of the priory, the wise and holy old man was just old. One day they decided to play a trick on him. 2 young monks persuaded the almost blind old man to come quickly to the priory chapel, where a huge crowd of pilgrims had turned up to hear him preach. In fact, the church was empty, and they intended having a good laugh at his expense as he preached his heart out to an empty church. According to the old story, the 2 young monks soon stopped their chuckling when the empty church was filled by angels. We may not perceive the angels ourselves at all, but after all, it's not the Venerable Bede preaching today. But we do live in the same spiritual context of the Venerable Bede. The letter to the Hebrews urges all believers to keep to the faith, to take courage against those who oppose us, because we witness before a heavenly Jerusalem, to which we already belong, and in which one day we shall reside. The fact that we do not see the angels does not mean they are not cheering us on. Such a faith, such a confidence, must never turn into the arrogance of the fanatic. We should all remain in awe and trembling before God, as Jeremiah and the prophets of old bear testimony. Nor should we allow our assurance of salvation to turn into the self-righteousness of the leader of the synagogue, who presumes his own unimpeachable credentials and assumes the right to bar others from coming into the kingdom. It is a double tragedy when we use the Bible to tell people they do not belong, rather than using the Bible to tell people they may freely enter the kingdom. We should always be alert to the danger, having once entered the ark ourselves, of pulling up the ladder behind us. Our calling to remain loyal to Christ is exercised in a hostile world. Sometimes we have to speak out against the world's injustices, its corruption, its foolishness, like young Jeremiah. But if we take on the right battle, we can trust that God will give us the right words. Sometimes, like those who received the letter to the Hebrews, we will be urged to forsake the side of Christ and join the world's army. There will be moments for all of us when we do fall prey to that temptation. The world is such a contrary place that even when we feel we are doing a good thing, such as when Jesus healed the woman in the synagogue, we find ourselves attacked by others with different priorities. It is therefore tempting to keep quiet in the face of contentious issues. We would rather keep friends with the world than speak the truth as we see it. But if we keep quiet, refuse to speak the word of the Lord, refrain from doing right through fear of the consequences, through the fear of being cancelled, then it is not only the old woman at the synagogue who goes through life hunched and bent double, but we condemn ourselves to follow in her footsteps. Amen.